remind you that in the back corner there is Brother Jack Fahey's albs that his wife, his widow, sent to us. She wants us to use them and enjoy them. I had them all dry cleaned, so they're ready to go. I hope you'll pick one out and take it home with you. Also, there are his stoles in the big UPS box back there, and I've donated some of my stoles since I've retired in a little plastic container. And there's still 2 chasubles from Brother Jack that his widow sent to us. She said she knew that he wanted them to be with us, the order, and so please enjoy them and take them, and just remember him as a faithful.
For those who didn't know Brother Jack,
yes.
Could you say something about his stature so that...
Brother Jack was a big man. Tall. Now, tall man.
6'5".
Big man. We had his cape on Brother Daniel, and it wasn't working.
It was dragging on the floor.
Yeah, so it wasn't working. And I think yes. Who took the cape? Brother Brent has the cape. A beautiful black wool cape that I wish I had on cold winter Easter sunrise mornings. But he had beautiful things, all from Almay. He just loved liturgy and looking, what did Brother Mark say today? The respectable, what was that with the clothes?
Recognizable.
There you go. Recognize, you couldn't deny that Brother Jack was a pastor. Yes.
Point about Brother Jack, he's responsible for the sanctoral cycle,
Yes.
which gave rise to the sanctoral cycle that's in the Book of Feasts and Holy Days, and also that's hinted at in the Book of Office and Services. So he was a part of Dort.
Yes, he was.
It's the sanctoral cycle was his contribution.
Yes, a very faithful part of Dort. So thank you for letting me make that announcement. Thank you. Well done.
Brother Jack will be memorialized at our service tomorrow night.
Yeah.
You will learn a lot more about him, I'm sure. Anybody else that absolutely needs to say something about the good of the order for now? Good. When we started planning for this 75th anniversary, the first name on my list and on the list of several others with immediate agreement was inviting Brother Don Saliers to be our keynote speaker to address us at this anniversary. And I was thrilled when he said yes. And so we are here tonight with him. Brief sketch of his career: school at Ohio Wesleyan, Yale Divinity School, Cambridge. Came back to Yale and taught for a few years, 7 or 8, I think you said. Then moving to Emory in 1974, where he's been employed or working for 47 years. This is his 55th year of teaching. Wow. Professor of theology and liturgy, the worship arts stuff. The William R. Cannon Emeritus Professor of Theology and Liturgy and Worship. That's all the fancy stuff. He's also the theologian in residence, which he says means he can teach anything he wants. Almost, right?
Yeah, almost.
For 45 years, he's been an oblate of the St. John's Abbey. For 8 years, he was chaplain of the American Guild of Organists. He was instrumental in the development, and I don't mean that as a pun, he was involved in the development of the book, the 1992 Book of Worship, and also the Worship Resources Project, which has been referred to a number of times here already, starting in 1970. Very active with that group. And he and I were talking about the order's influence with the anointing rite in that book. So the order has indeed have had influence in that way. If you're going to be a part of the American Guild of Organists, you're going to be a musician. And so he has been an organist and a choir master for many, many years. He has authored 15 books and a plethora of articles that some of you probably have read and taken to heart. He is proud of the fact that he is the father of one half of the Indigo Girls, his daughter Emily. And together they have written the book, A Song to Sing, A Life to Live. It's going to be on my list of books to purchase. So, he's been a part of the order since about 89 or 90, somewhere in that era. Very much influenced and encouraged and nurtured by Hoyt L. Hickman. We throw around that name. I do it with a great holiness in my sense of remembering Hoyt. And if you ever used From Ashes to Fire, as I did in the early stages of my ministry, you have Brother Don to thank. And he also was involved in the development of the Handbook of the Christian Year. Both editions or? Both editions, yeah. And he has been involved with the order as the faculty advisor, you'll be happy to know, as we mentioned earlier today, of the St. Benedict chapter at Emory, Candler School of Theology. With that, I give you our brother, Don Saliers.
Wonderful to be with you. And meeting new friends, keeping the old, I hope. But when I mentioned the other day, that I was remembering Hoyt Hickman and Larry Stuckey and Jim White, I mean that because the four of us worked together over a number of years, and some of you who knew Jim knew that he had a farmhouse in Passumpsic, Vermont, and so for breakfast when we were working on these things in his farmhouse, he would say, would someone go out and get the eggs for the omelet? So he had a sense of humor, but the omelets were good. That's because eventually Susan White cooked them, but that's another question. St. Augustine, as you all know, starts the confessions this way. Great are you, O Lord, exceedingly worthy of praise. Your power is immense, your wisdom beyond reckoning, and so we humans, who are a due part of your creation, long to praise you. We who carry our mortality about with us, carry the evidence of our sin, and with it the proof that you thwart the proud. Yet these humans, due part of your creation as they are, still do long to praise you, because you have made us and drawn us to yourself. And you can repeat this phrase, our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. Our hearts are unquiet until they rest in you. And then the simple prayer, grant me to know and understand. And therein then unfolds the confessions. I want to share with you and hope we continue this conversation, so it's not just a lecture, this is an invitation. All theology is an invitation to conversation and dialogue and shared life, as we do here in this order. So I want to start out with reflections under the title, The Lamentable and the Praiseworthy. The Lamentable and the Praiseworthy. And then toward the end, give a reflection on prayer as the language of the human heart and liturgy as the common prayer of human hearts, answering the invitation that Augustine's prayer puts before us at the beginning of the Confessions. And along the way, to explore 4 forms of truth-telling. Lament. Hey, tell us like it is, will you? Don't hide. The lamentable. Confession. Speak from your heart. Cleanse the thoughts of our hearts, we pray in Psalm 51. Witness, like we heard in this morning's chapel, a profound witness in that sermon. And finally, praise. So, lament, confession, witness, and praise. 4 forms of truth-telling that this world needs so desperately, and I must say, politically has forgotten. Morally, perhaps, has forgotten. And the church itself is right on the edge of its enculturation into forgetfulness. But what else is new? If I start improvising, it's only because my father was a jazz musician and I never recovered. So,
Go with the riff.
all right, thank you. Someone knows the language. So, some reflections on the lamentable and the praiseworthy as a way into this. Everyday life confronts us with undeniable contrasts. A neighborhood walk in a forest hike can dazzle me and dazzle you with beauty. And the colors are coming, aren't they? And then we learn of another killing, or of starving, parentless children. We almost dance for joy at the end, or at least the news of some kind of pandemic ending, vaccine, only to learn of the denials and the lies. We learn and rejoice in the birth of a long-expected grandchild. That's from my generation now, or great-grandchild for some of us, only to be coupled with the unexpected death of a beloved grandparent. The joy of friendship followed by betrayal. Hope nurtured, hope dashed. Beauty and terror, side by side. That is our human condition. The lamentable and the beauty, so intimately interwoven into this mortal life of ours. And this is the rhythm. This is the primordial rhythm. And we find it where? In our tradition, in the bones of our tradition, in the breath and heartbeat of our tradition. I'm talking about the Psalms, of course. But I'm also talking about liturgy. Over time, season after season, in which the lamentable and the praiseworthy succeed one another and come back on one another. This is our rhythm. This is the rhythm of life. And this is why liturgy is so appropriate. It fits us. God knew this when liturgy emerged from the very beginning. So just as our world is filled with the lamentable and the praiseworthy, so the ancient biblical poems, those Hebrew hymns, reflect an attempt to live truthfully and speak in the face of the paradoxical contrasts, don't they? Such life and language, so intermingled, are in the Psalter, and they are always, as Samuel Terrian said in an older book, always forged in the elusive presence of God. So, our worship this morning, I have to say, I probably just should stop and we should do mystagogy on what happened to us this morning. Don't you think? I mean, how's your mystagogy, by the way? This is the footnote. Footnotes are always from the left, and Albert or Dicta are from the right, so this is a footnote. How is your mystagogy? This is another whole lecture, sorry, but it's intruding. It's coming in here from another screen, another source. We've lost the art of mystagogy, so people don't even recognize what they've experienced. You know, it's a very American thing to say, hey man, boy, that was terrific, that really hit me. That was so wonderful. What is it was so wonderful? I don't know, it was just wonderful. The loss of the content of our experience because there's no one to take us back through the feel of it, the pulse of it, the tense of it, the pitch of it, the harmonic overtones of it. What goes on and settles in us over time and makes us terrified or wondrously flexible and open to the mystery of God and one another. That was that lecture I didn't talk about, okay. Mystagogy. I commend to you at the next, that someone take up that topic of mystagogy and the loss of it, and the great loss of that in our churches. All right, but enough of that. Will you sit down? Just quit the footnotes, will you? Yeah, okay, thank you. So here we are. When I begin to reflect on my experience, and I think it will resonate with yours, on the tensive rhythms, the never-ending rhythms of the lamentable and the praiseworthy, we turn again and again to the Psalms because it's all there. Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord, or, my God, you've abandoned me. Or, how long, O Lord? And then suddenly, that amazing ending of the whole Psalter, in which finally we lose our breath in praise. It's all ecstatic. Oh, by the way, don't forget, if you study that cantata, the final 5 Psalms of the Psalter, you realize that the pain is not forgotten. The poor are still there. Thank you. Well, so it is. So when I think about the tensive rhythms of lament and praise in the Psalms, I begin to see that they were meant for us, that God has provided us in these ancient texts what the feel of life is. And if you can get the feel of life and share that, truth opens up. I won't say a whole lot more about that until we visit the way in which the 4 forms of truth-telling belong together. On the one hand, we pray the Psalms seeking refuge and consolation from suffering and injustice, a very help in times of trouble, as we say. On the other hand, we hear a fierce opposition to all who are enemies of God's covenanted chesed, loving kindness. Many of the Psalms aim at both inward and external oppressions. From the create in me a clean heart, O God, remove me from my own self-oppression, to rise up, O Lord, do not forget the oppressed. How long? Have you forgotten us? The clenched fist and the open hand are from the same human gesture. So, when we cry out with the Psalms, we embody the truth God wishes for us. Let me put it another way entirely. Well, it's not an entirely different way, but here's the way to think about it. The Psalms, just as good liturgy with integrity, speak to the gap between the world as it is and the world as it ought to be. When our 4 daughters were growing up, one of the great practices we somehow kept intact was Sunday conversation around the table. And no holds were barred. They could ask anybody, anything. And as children are wont to do, the persistent two questions, again and again and again, were fairness and the expression, you know, it's not fair. That started in grade school. This is not fair. Or the old one was, why is so much people suffering? Why is there so much suffering? Why is it so unfair and why is there so much suffering? Those children, those daughters of mine, keep asking the questions, including those of you who know Emily's music. She keeps asking those questions in those songs. And I was told by a friend who lives in Chicago, went to Ravinia. Any of you have been in Chicago and seen a wonderful place, the venue there? She and her partner and their violinist played at Ravinia for 10,000 people last week. And I thought, I'm lucky to get 13 people in a room to listen. I have to say. So, thank God for the music. Thank God for those conversations around that table. What Luther called Tischreden, speech around the table. No holds barred. And the profound questions that I see permeating the Psalter were on the lips of those young girls at the time, and all. So the sense of divine presence hovers when we dare speak the truth about what is lamentable, but co-equally witness to what is praiseworthy. How many still read C.S. Lewis? Okay, if you haven't, you should be hosed down. C.S. Lewis is still okay. Not all of C.S. Lewis, but he was really good on the praise point. He said, you know, for a long time I thought the problem with theology is it makes God into a praise monger, always wanting us to praise, you know. And then he said, oy vey. No, he didn't say oy vey. Suddenly it struck me. Lovers praise their beloved. Poets praise the beauty of nature and their country. Patriots praise the country. And then he said, it suddenly struck me. Praise was not some obligation. Praise was not something laid on us as a demand. It's the natural completion of joy. It's the natural completion of what you're really perceiving. I like that working both ends. Lament is a legitimate completion of the clutch in the heart, the gasp in the throat. And praise is that immense opening, vulnerable opening to the beauty of the world. The terror and the beauty are both there. So the lamentable and the praiseworthy. Seemingly innocent and abstract until you take them on in your life. And in my case, until I heard my children teaching us about those things. The gap between the world as it is and the world as it ought to be. I know, you see, you're all so intelligent because you're thinking, he's going to talk about eschatology. That's right. I'm not going to get there right away. I mean, you don't just walk into the breakfast table and say, how's your eschatology this morning? You might ask how your eggs are or how's your coffee. But we'll get to it. We'll get to it because that's exactly where theology enters into the eschatological mode of its best insights into the truth. What is promised to us about the gap between the terrifying suffering, the terrifying untruth of the world, the unfairness and the suffering, and how the gospel speaks, how the scriptures speak, how the psalms of praise utter the name of God. So we must reckon then with the complexity here. Some of you have read about the first naivete and the second naivete. Don't worry about who wrote it or what. It's fancy stuff. But right now all I want to say is, with those children, they allowed me as a practicing theologian who's paid to say words about God, a second naivete about some of the simplest things that allow me at a funeral to sing, I come to the garden alone, though it is not the first in my hit list. I said hit list. Not in the first idiom I'd want at my funeral. But it's allowed me to sing that because there's some people who experience the gap, and what they have to sing is, I come to the garden alone, he's there, and he speaks and he talks. But it's also there in Benjamin Britten's Requiem. One still hangs where shelled roads part. And those war poems from the First War by Wilfred Owen are combined with the most magnificent text from the liturgy for the dead, the liturgy for burial. So whether a simple dulcimer and a single cracked voice, or a full Robert Shaw choir and orchestra, it's there even in the music and the best art we have. This struggle to live in the tension between the already and the not yet, between what the world is and how it works, and how God has promised us that it need not be so. It need not be so. So the Psalms in our liturgy take the gap seriously. And over all these things are the stark contrasts between the righteous and the wicked. Psalm 1, thank you very much. Psalm 2, the great gateway to the whole Psalter. Psalm 1, like a tree planted by the river, so on. But also, why do the nations rage? You enter into that gate, and you're in for something. You're in for the very thing that is our subject for tonight. Yet, for all the seemingly familiar things about the Psalms, I want to say they remain also strange to us. This is Karl Barth's Strange New World of the Bible, I suppose. We recognize that our contemporary world, our behaviors, our emotional depths of crying out praise or lament, our personal depressions and consolations, and the many familiar Psalms are yet still over against us. May I put it this way? The Psalms, like good liturgy, wait for us. Psalms lie in wait for us. Footnote. Oh, how I covet for any local congregation, whether 18 people in a small village or a big church someplace, to simply take the Psalms seriously again. Sometimes the simplest thing is best. Open up the Psalms and see what's there. But of course you can't open up the Psalms for the Christian community without also opening up the hymn book. And how many hymns are but paraphrases of the Psalms? And then you can't do that without opening up the anthems, which are so often based on the very tensions we're talking about here in the Psalms. And by the way, Psalms of lament are not popular until life forces us to hear them again. To hear the ancient psalmists cry as ours, other, over against us from another culture, suddenly ours. Of course, this also happens too when we hear music from another culture and we realize they're just as capable and more capable than we are. Of course, I'm talking about the spirituals here too. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Now, historically, I lost my mother when I was 4, so there's something about that, and each of you can find an equivalent somewhere that has a personal note. But also, you can say those stands, those psalms, and those liturgies still wait on us. They're over against us. They're not our ordinary cultural patois. language from God. Sometimes slant. Thank you, Emily Dickinson. Tell the truth and tell it slant. And God has this wonderful way of slanting in, sort of from the side, or wounding us from behind when we least expected it. So I'm just trying to plow the ground here for the fact that the Christian imagination has resources here that then can find their way into the heart. We could go on a long time, and it would be wonderful if we had several hours here for you to tell me what language from what psalm has riveted you, has come to you as your very life-giving words. And finally you say, it is as though God speaks those words, sings those words. And isn't it marvelous in a good worship service when what we sing, we suddenly hear the prophets singing through us, and the saints, and the angels, and maybe God's own self speaking with us. Well, I could go on a lot. Right now I'm struggling to write a book, a theological commentary on the Psalms, so that's why you're getting this, you know. But I want to take that seriously. I want to take the Psalter as an enormous gift that the church has, and then trace how the Psalms are the basis of the language of praise and lament in our liturgies. And then it gets even more complex. How an Eastern Orthodox troparion might speak a narrative in the language of the Psalms in a way you didn't expect it, and so on. Give us ears to hear. Now I want to turn, kind of in the remaining part of this reflection, to the point about 4 forms of truth-telling, because in some ways, don't we want the truth about ourselves, about our world, about God? We live in such obscurity when it comes to these truths about ourselves. You don't have to read Tom Merton very far. You don't have to read any of the mystical women. You know, Teresa of Avila, our sisters who kept saying these things in these mystical ways, they knew about the question of the true self and the false self. They knew that unless the heart were inflamed by the very Spirit of God and the language of God, it would not find itself. It would remain, as Augustine says, unquiet, restless. Restless for what? If you're like me, and you are, I'm going to claim that, I'm sorry, I presume on you. You really are restless for someone to just plain tell the truth. Speak the truth in their heart. Knowing full well that even in our attempts to speak the truth, we are caught in the paradoxes of our own self. So all of our great teachers, all of our great religious teachers, speak about finding and distinguishing the true from the false. Tell us what's true. And then, thank God, every once in a while you come across a person who lives truthfully. They may not say much. I've got one in mind. The first church I served in rural Ohio, Drell Grant, 94, farmed, never said much to many people. You know, kind of ain't talking today, nothing much to say. And then one Sunday in one of my pastoral cares, I always loved going there because his wife Effie was 92, and they'd lived in this darn farmhouse for, I don't know, since the Pleistocene period, I think. And I kept thinking, well, these are very, simple, so on people, until one day he brought a box out of stones. And he said, "You've never seen stones like this, have you, Pastor?" I said, "No." It was a box full of stones from Petoskey, Michigan, with all, if you've seen those stones, you realize that these are embedded early creatures. And these are what do you want to call archaeological marvels. And so he proceeded to lecture me on the stones that he had picked up in Petoskey, Michigan, and how God must be at work a long time, and was at work a long time ago in the earth, in these stones, in that water, and those creatures, and whatever. And suddenly I'm just in awe of his sharing that truth that he had discovered. And in telling the truth about the stones in the box, I suddenly realized this man just tells the truth. He also refrains from telling the untruth. And so I carry around in my heart this memory of a person who said very little, but who lived so truthfully and so transparently. It's kind of like those creatures in those stones. It's clear and obvious. Well, you can tell stories like that too, because every once in a while in your parish work or in your teaching or in your daily life, for God's sake, you meet someone who just is truthful. And it changes everything. You can trust them. It's like meeting a person who's very grateful. I guess all I want to say here is the world of the grateful heart is very different from the world of the ungrateful heart. Why is that? Does that mean that the grateful person goes around feeling something that you don't feel? No, I don't know. Being grateful and feeling grateful may have to be distinguished in some cases. Oh, I'm so happy, I'm so grateful, I won the prize. If your child says that at age 7, you want to, if you're a good moral parent, you say, that's nice. But you don't make a big thing out of it because you know there are greater joys and deeper gratitudes ahead yet. You don't want to exhaust gratitude in that. Does this make sense to you? I'm just calling up something from my own experience here about this. So the language of the grateful heart, the language that can speak truthfully and with great pleasure over a small stone in a box, is something to teach us complicated people that sometimes find a long way toward the truth, a far way from us. So now the 4 forms, you can see what I'm working at. 4 forms of truth-telling that are, I think, indigenous to the gospel. But I also want to say indigenous to humanity discovering its own self in the presence of God. Does that make sense? These are indigenous forms to the scriptures, especially to the Psalms, but also to the Gospels, to all of the great scripture, but also indigenous to what it is when humanity finds itself in the presence of God. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about praying the Psalms and joining in the liturgy. Martin Luther once said, faith is prayer, nothing but prayer. Now, I don't think he meant that we were talking all the time, always using words. I think he had in mind what St. Paul had in mind when he said, pray without ceasing, which means keep your heart going. Because the language of prayer is nothing other than the language of the heart at full stretch in the presence of God. And the same is true. And you've been in liturgies. I think we were in a couple today. This is one of the blessings of being a member of the order. You do begin to see the centrality of Eucharist and liturgy itself. But you've been in places where suddenly you realize you're in the presence of truth speaking. Sometimes that's when you're in the presence of the truthful lament, where someone speaks truthfully. I think, don't you think we've been through a period when you see the first responders, or you see the nurses, or the orderlies, and the physicians too, And they describe the operating theater. They describe the place where the funny sounds are made by our equipment. They don't say, I'm lamenting this. Their very description bears the lament of the heart. So you don't have to use the word lament or the word sorrow in order to evoke a sense of the tragic, a sense of the lamentable. But on the same side, on the other side, you've been with people who have described something like, I don't know, these people are so kind. This room is so full of good energy, someone might say. A little more new generation. There's a lot of good vibrations here. There's energy. And they don't have to say, geez, I'm just so full of praise. But you know they're grateful. And you know they perceived something that's joyful. Well, I think that's what I want to say about this. If Luther is right, of course not everything in faith is prayer, but I'd like to think of it this way, like a couple of the old folks, that is to say in the early church said, you know, like Origen and some other gang people like that. Even Tertullian might have said it, though Tertullian got into trouble in a hurry, but he was always saying something strange like, you know, the whole life of a Christian is one long prayer. And sometimes I'm stopped dead in my tracks when I think of that. How have I prayed my life this far? And it's true. There are times when I had no words, but I had tears. There are times when I had no words, but I had an embrace. There are times when I had no words, but I heard the song and saw the dance of the child. Saw the cup of cold water given. And there's nothing like it. That's the heart that is awakened to true praise. And if I'm not mistaken, I mean, for example, one of my favorite songs is 104. And it's no accident that in Pentecost Sunday, we use a phrase from that 104 as the antiphon. Lord, send forth your Spirit and renew the face of the earth. Antiphons, as you know. Some Methodists, sort of get the hives when you start talking antiphons. But anyway, that's another whole question. That's another lecture from over here. But you know that signifies the final prayer. Oh, send forth your Spirit. Renew the face of the earth. Renew us. Renew our hearts. Renew the whole thing. Teach us to dance again. Teach us to love again. And then in 100,000 popular songs, it's echoed in ways that people don't understand what the source of it is. It's all right. It's all right. Let the culture go ahead. This language will catch up somehow. So, the first point is sincere and truthful lament is truth-telling. I'm not going to bother you with footnotes about politicians who can't take it. We've set it up so they can't take it. I feel badly. I feel badly that someone can't lament. By the way, you pastors, you know this. There are whole communities that don't know how to lament very well. We have all kinds of things to talk about here. Trauma, and how do you get at it? How do you ever get out of it? Well, we could go on with that, but you see that attached to each of these points is an enormous open to what the church has to offer. So just in that first, lament as a form of truth-telling. Ponder that. I just give it to you because I'm trying to understand it myself. The second thing, of course, is confession. And this community knows a variety of ways in which we try to tell the truth about ourselves before God. By the way, that's not an easy thing, is it? I get into the middle of confessing and I begin to do qualifications. I begin to temporize I begin to say, yeah, with respect to A, J, K, and Z, I'm pretty much of a sinner. But with respect to element M and N, not to mention Q. No, don't mention Q, please. I'm not so bad. So, the notion of confessing our sin is not so much an obligation as it is, this is the reverse of what C.S. Lewis says about praise. Confessing the sin is to confront ourselves before the presence of God and in the company of those who love us. Now, if you're in the company of those who hate you, then there's no use. But if you're in the company of people who say, oh, please, don't you see this is going wrong? I learned more of this from AA than I do from the church. That's another lecture, by the way. What we can learn from Alcoholics Anonymous. My father was an alcoholic. Some of you may have had experience with this, but this is back in the old days when the smoke in the room was so thick. And thank God I was only 10 or 11. I was underneath the smoke. And the coffee was blacker than the Okefenokee swamp. But people struggle to tell the truth there. And sometimes I just wish the church would learn that a little bit. Sometimes of the things that are going on in our church basements. So, confessing is in a way, it's a certain form. It's a certain form of lament. It's a lament focused on the patterns of our life. But then there's witness. And I have to say, Sister Rebecca was a witness today. In a way that was so powerful for all of us. And when that happens in church, you're someplace where someone is telling the truth. Not all of it is going to be as strong and as dramatic as what we heard from you, dear sister, today. But sometimes it comes in very small little ways, but it's there, that witness. I've even known youth groups to witness. I mean, really. And suddenly you say, there's something to say. There's something, if God does something, say something. This is Mary Oliver all over the place. How many of you are Mary Oliver fans? I'm a Mary Oliver fan. She talks about prayer all the time, only it's just like, pay attention. That's it. Well, of course, you have to have blue irises, and you have to have Blackwater Pond, and you have to have this wonderful grasshopper in your hand. Yeah, those will help. Those are forms of prayer. Yeah, so Mary Oliver just keeps at it, of blessed memory. Pay attention. And if you see something, say so, for God's sake. That's witness. Okay? You with me on that one? Yeah. So it's not so hard after all. Most of the time we're silent about our witness. And sometimes the witness simply turns into advertising and we're lost. You can sell any product if you have a good enough line. But how on earth do you sell God if you can't tell the truth about what God has done? Okay, what does that leave over? Well, it leaves over the final contrast between the lamentable and the praiseworthy. Where do you find praise? Now here's where it gets wonderful. Because if you take Psalm 104 seriously, or any one of a number of Psalms, Psalm 19, yeah, even the great Psalm 119, you say, well, heck, that's Jewish. They're all Jewish. But so I want to say finally about where do you find praise? And I'm asking that now as a personal question. And I do, as I opened the talk, I said you can take a walk in the woods and suddenly, when you least expect it, the leaves are praising. The bark is praising. The flowers are praising. This is what Rejoice in the Lamb has. And the great text from Christopher Smart, which is in that wonderful piece, orchestral and choral piece, it says, you know, the letters of the alphabet will praise God? That was the old Kabbalistic thing. That was the old mystical thing. You know. Let A praise God. How does A praise God for you? So suddenly the birds, I remember having a twilight walk, and I was preoccupied with God knows what. Something I'd done or said, or something, mostly someone else said, you know. And suddenly, in the last fading sun, at the top of the trees, there was this illumination, and it was accompanied by a bird that suddenly just let go with the most incredible, melismatic thing I'd ever heard. Olivier Messiaen would have loved that. It was a great, if you don't know Messiaen, he wrote about the birds and loved to write the birds. Suddenly the praise was being done for you. Suddenly you were joining the creature's praise. And that's so great in the Psalms, that all creation will praise God, and we're meant for that. You know, that's what we're meant for. So that one evening's walk and you have 100, I hope you have 100 examples in your own life of how you suddenly realize creation is going to praise God no matter what. And sometimes in spite of me and in spite of us. So that notion of praise is enormously deep and wide, and this is what we're meant for. We're meant for that. In fact, that's the only way, finally, we're going to find out who we are. Created in the image of God, created for the sound of God in all of God's works. Even in Psalm 19, it says there is no voice, but they're heard. I love that paradox, you know. It says everything is praising God, everything is speaking God, but there is no voice. They're not heard. But you know you're hearing the very voice of God, echoing through all that God has created. If the human heart is capable of lament in the form of the fiercest things the world can throw to us, then surely the reverse is even more true, that the human heart awaits the sound of all creation praising the Creator. And then you begin to learn the song, and the heart awakens. And as Gerard Manley Hopkins, great Jesuit poet, says, you know, the beauty was there, but the beholder wanting. Which two they once meet, the heart rears wings and hurls, half hurls earth off from under our feet. I hope that's happened to you. It can happen in the liturgy. And what I hope happens to people is they learn it somewhere in their life and they bring it to the liturgy and say, oh my God, that's what it's about. That's what it's about. Well, I didn't mean quite so carried away, but after all, I was in the presence of preachers today. And by the way, Dwight, that remarkable reading that you gave us, that's going to stay with us a long time. So, what is it to live between heaven and earth? As Luther once said, crawling between heaven and earth in our finitude. Okay, all right. I mean, just waking up in the morning and heading out into a world of lamentables and praiseworthies. The final word, of course, is the truth of God that requires both. May start in lament, but like so many of the great lament psalms, ends in praise. I don't know about you, but I thank God that that's how creation is. That's how we are. Someone knows us. Someone knows the human heart here and has given us words, but above all has given us life that can see into the depths and cry out in agony and pain. and can look into the depths and cry out in nothing but ecstatic praise. Everything that breathes, praise the Lord. Everything that lives because God has poured life and love into us all. And that's what we're meant for. But in the meantime, quite short of the eschaton, quite short of the great choir when we'll all be singing on key, I hear. That's what I hear.
Not if Charles Ives has anything to do with it.
Okay, all right, whatever. Short of that, here we live. Here we live. And it's up to those of us who catch sense of this great mystery that is given to us in the lamentable and the praiseworthy. And we learn to live and speak the truth in the presence of God and one another. That would change everything. That would change everything. It wouldn't take our finitude away, but it would change everything. Like the human heart coming home. Like the human heart finding an end to its restlessness in the true source of our heart and our life and all of creation. Well, that's what I want to say to you, dear sisters and brothers, dear siblings in this organization, because I think that's partly what OS, or what we're about here. And we must continually remind one another about this. So, that's all I wanted to say. And now, what I wrote and what I said, I better try to live into. Okay? Will you promise me to help me? I promise to help you. And that may be the other secret to human community. Thank you. Oh, okay, sure. Yes, I love any responses, anything that you have experienced that chimes with what we're saying here. Yeah.
I loved your comments about mystagogy, and we've worked at that some
Yes, you have.
here. Would you say something about mystagogy, and I think you used the words recognizing what we've experienced and so forth, and the theme of the new creation?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, all of you have heard the word, and it has this wonderful etymology. I mean, it's the mystery of what we've experienced. Finding words to speak what we've experienced. So when it comes to the question of what has been promised, say, how do we speak of something we haven't, fully understood? But when you stop to think of it, isn't that the language of love from the beginning? We don't fully understand when we find ourselves being loved or loving. So we keep at the question. And what we need are companions to remind us what it's like, not only to experience the love given as gift, and this is, of course, the heart of it is the gift giving of God. How do you remember the gift giving of God in its innocent, small ways and in its big, profound ways? So mystagogy for me seems crucial, and I know you've done a lot of work in this, a number of you here. But I do think it's missing in our ordinary parish experiences. I don't know what we're substituting for it. Stuff.
Coffee hour.
And sometimes good stuff, of course. But mystagogy has no book of answers because it's a living process, if you will, to use an old Jewish thing. It's like getting a whole community to do midrash. It's dangerous. It's dangerous. Oh my God, you hear what she said, about her experience? Well, I never had that experience anyway. But true mystagogy opens up the vulnerability of saying, I did experience this. But more importantly, not individually, but what have we just come through? And a lot of us are going to need a pretty good dose of good mystagogy, truthful mystagogy, to untangle what we've come through and what we're still going through. So that would be a starting point. And I think of mystagogy not as someone standing up and saying what we've experienced, and that's a problem with some preaching, but rather that invitation to dig deeply and to find what the implications are of what we did together. Sometimes I think the youth groups are much more open to that than we think. Yeah, I mean, if you ever talk to them after they've come back from a really good service project, they've got lots to talk about, and they want to talk about it in detail, including the funny details. You know, does that make sense to you all? I do think that this is a big topic, and some of you are very much have read a lot about it, but it's the practice that's so crucial. That's a start. That's only scratching the surface there. I mean, this happens in our personal life, quite apart from the question of the community of faith. If my daughters at that table withheld and didn't tell me what was unfair about the time in the classroom that such and such happened, I couldn't have helped much. But because they were detailed in their recounting of the unfairness, we could talk, and there could be some resolution. I think it's as important as that, and as human as that. Yeah, that's a whole wonderful thing. Anything else? Have any of you had experiences of when you're just walking out there and suddenly the whole world is singing? I'm sure you've had that, you know. The whole world is suddenly singing. And maybe like Psalm 19, there wasn't any sound.
Where, if anywhere in the truth-telling, does rebellion happen?
Okay. Yeah. Lots of places, yes. And I think sometimes rebellion against the cliches, the religious cliches, is absolutely necessary because people have hidden in the cliches. And, you know, that's why truth-telling is not reading QAnon. It's true, isn't it? That a whole bunch of people can believe that. I remember first hearing the myth of the sword of Damocles. Do you know what that is? Some of you know about that. You know, at least my version of it is that there may be another version of it. The sword is in the ceiling and it's going to fall down and kill somebody sometime. Is that the same one you had? Yeah. So everyone is fretting. Whole villages are bound up with the stories about the sword and it's going to kill somebody and you better watch out and we don't know when it's going to happen and so on. And so the whole village is held in thrall by this story. It reminds me of a scene from Raiders of the Lost Ark. Remember when the guy's got all these swords and he's coming at him and it's kind of a violent. But he you know, it's what's his name? Harrison Ford. I mean, what's his name in the film? Okay, Indiana. So this guy's coming at him with all of these swords, and he just goes boom, and that's it. The other great film, of course, is Brother, Where Art Thou? Yeah. Well, you know, remember George Clooney's in there. The revenuers are coming, and the house is on fire. He and his two odd friends. And one of the great lines in all of film was uttered by George Clooney in that house. The house is burning, they're firing at him, and he says, "Damn, we're in a tight spot." He really told the truth right there. Kind of a confession, you know. But I do think that when people are in tight spots and they don't have fierce resistance, they're liable to be caught into a way of life that perpetuates the cliches or the danger and gives us no human way out. I think sometimes the children of Israel really felt that way. And sometimes those psalms, especially the exilic psalms, feel like people have been in really tight spots for a long time. And some of them are just damn tired of it and rebel.
How can we sing the Lord's song?
Yeah, 137. I mean, it's like, it's like the jokes from the prison joke book. You call out the numbers and everyone laughs. That's kind of the way it is. 137. And there's nothing more devastating than that business at the end. That's how can we sing the song, Lord's Song in a foreign land? And we know that has a history. Frederick Douglass used that in a speech, by the way. By the way, I'm just thinking about this. I've just written a little section on this. Psalm 137 has more cultural applications than we think. This has found its way into music, into Godspeed, into all kinds of things. So especially Haitian music and reggae and so on. That song has had cultural import that people don't even know the source of it anymore. But of course, the hardest thing is the ending of it. Vengeance. I take those kids. By the way, there have been good exegetes that have avoided the literalism of it. You got to take the literalism seriously because someone really thinks, I'm going to do to the kids what your adults did to me. But anyway, I thought Augustine's little spiritualization at the ending of Psalm 47 is pretty clever. He said, when we say we're going to dash the kids' heads against the stone, those are all your little sins. You've got to take care of them before they become adults. How about that for exegesis? That's not going to fly. That's not going to fly in your Old Testament course. But it's a way of saying there are ways of reading these things that really become very useful to us. So I would like to take care of the small sins before they get to be big ones. Unfortunately, some of them have gotten out of hand and have grown up, and they're lurking down the hallways of the back roads of the windmills of my mind, and the church too. I think you've exhausted yourselves with that. So I hope this has been helpful. Maybe a new angle on Psalms and liturgy and their interconnection, and especially our struggle to live and tell the truth in our time. So.